I always thought camping was supposed to be about escaping the noise of the world. You know, trading in the hum of traffic and the glow of screens for the crackle of a fire and the hush of the woods. But the thing about the woods is, they have their own kind of noise. It's quieter, sure, but it's never really silent. There's always something moving just out of sight, always a branch snapping. Always a breeze that sounds a little too much like a whisper. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you realize you're not alone out there. Not really. I've spent a lot of nights under the stars, and I've heard a lot of stories. Some are just that, stories told to spook the new guy or pass the time when the fire burns low. But every now and then, you hear something that sticks with you. Something that makes you look over your shoulder when you're walking back to your tent, or double check the zipper before you try to sleep. These are the stories that don't fade with the morning light. These are the stories that make you wonder what's really out there, waiting in the dark. Tonight, I want to share 4 of those stories with you. For true camping stories, each one told to me by someone who swears it happened just the way they remember. Maybe you'll believe them, maybe you won't, but I promise, by the end, you'll never look at a quiet night in the woods the same way again. Let's start with the first one. I call it the Lantern Man. It was late September, the kind of night where the air is just starting to bite, and the leaves are more on the ground than in the trees. My friend Alex had invited me and a couple of others to his family's old hunting cabin, way up in the attic. The place was barely more than a shack, no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and a couple of bunks. We were all in our early 20s, still convinced we were invincible, and more interested in cheap beer and ghost stories than actual hunting. The first night was uneventful. We cooked over the fire, played cards, and tried to outdo each other with scary stories. But the second night, something changed. We'd just finished dinner when Alex suggested we go for a walk. Let's see if we can find the old logging road, he said, grinning like he knew something we didn't. The moon was bright enough that we didn't bother with flashlights, just stumbled along the path, laughing and shoving each other. About half a mile from the cabin, we found the road. It was little more than a pair of ruts in the dirt, overgrown with weeds and brambles. We followed it for a while, the woods pressing in on either side, until we came to a clearing. That's when we saw the light. At first, I thought it was another group of campers. There was a lantern, swinging gently, maybe 100 yards away. But as we watched, the light started to move, slowly, deliberately, weaving between the trees. It didn't bounce like someone walking, it glided, almost like it was floating. We stood there, frozen, watching as the lantern moved closer, then stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light winked out. We waited, barely breathing, straining to hear anything over the pounding of our own hearts. But the woods were silent, no footsteps, no voices, nothing. Finally, Alex whispered, "Let's go." We turned and hurried back the way we'd come, tripping over roots and each other in our rush to get back to the cabin. We didn't talk much that night. Nobody wanted to admit how scared we'd been. But the next morning, we went back to the clearing. There was nothing there. No sign of a campfire, no footprints, nothing. Just the empty woods and the memory of that impossible, floating light. Years later, I heard a story from one of the old-timers in town. He said that back in the 1930s, a logger had gone missing in those woods. They found his lantern, still burning, hanging from a branch. But they never found him. Some people say his spirit still wanders the forest, searching for a way home. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw that night, and I know I'll never forget the way that lantern moved, silent and steady, through the trees. That's the thing about the woods. They remember, even if you try to forget. The second story comes from a woman named Rachel. She grew up camping with her family every summer, always at the same spot, a little state park by a lake, tucked away from the main road. She told me this story over coffee one morning, her hands wrapped tight around the mug, her eyes never quite meeting mine. She said it happened when she was 16. Her parents had let her bring a friend, and the two of them had set up their own tent a little ways from the main site, just far enough to feel independent. The first night was perfect, swimming, s'mores, the whole deal. But the second night something felt off. Rachel woke up around 2 in the morning, the way you do when you're not sure why you're awake. At first, she thought it was just the wind, rattling the tent. But then she heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone walking just outside the thin nylon wall. She held her breath, listening. The footsteps circled the tent, slow and deliberate. She could hear her friend breathing, fast and shallow, on the other side of the tent. Then, a voice, low, almost a whisper. "Are you awake in there?" It was a man's voice, rough and unfamiliar. Rachel didn't move. She didn't dare. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, There was only silence. Then, the voice again, closer this time. "I know you're in there." Rachel's friend started to cry. Just a little whimper, barely audible. The footsteps moved away, then came back. Something brushed against the side of the tent, making the whole thing shudder. Rachel squeezed her friend's hand, willing herself not to scream. Finally, after what felt like hours, the footsteps faded. Rachel lay there, rigid, until the sky started to lighten. When they finally unzipped the tent, there was nothing outside, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But on the side of the tent, right by where Rachel's head had been, there was a single, muddy handprint. Rachel never went camping again. Some stories stick with you not because of what happened, but because of what could have happened. Rachel's story is one of those, the kind that makes you realize how thin the line is between safety and something much darker. It's easy to laugh off a strange noise in the woods when you're sitting around a fire with friends. But when you're alone in the dark, every sound becomes a question you're not sure you want answered. I remember the first time I heard Rachel's story. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about that muddy handprint, about the way the voice had known they were in there. It's the kind of detail that makes you wonder how many times you've been watched without realizing it. How many times you've been just a thin layer of fabric away from something, or someone, you never wanted to meet. But not every story is about strangers. Sometimes, the scariest things are the ones that come from within, from the people you trust the most. That brings me to the third story, which I call the Echoes. This one comes from a guy named Marcus. He was a few years older than me, the kind of person who always seemed to have a story for every occasion. But when he told me this one, his voice was different, quieter, almost like he was afraid the story might hear him telling it. Marcus and his brother, Tyler, had always been close. They grew up in a small town, spent their summers fishing and hiking, and every fall they'd go on a camping trip together. It was their tradition, just the two of them, a way to reconnect before the chaos of the holidays. One year, they decided to try a new spot, a remote stretch of forest about an hour from their hometown. It was supposed to be beautiful, with a clear stream and plenty of wildlife. They packed light, just enough for a weekend, and set out early on a Friday morning. The first day was perfect. They hiked, fished, and set up camp by the water. That night, they sat by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, the way brothers do. But as the fire died down, Marcus noticed something strange. Every time he spoke, he heard an echo, not just from the trees, but from somewhere deeper in the woods. At first, he thought it was just the acoustics, the way sound bounces in the forest. But the more he listened, the more he realized the echo wasn't quite right. It didn't repeat his words exactly. Sometimes, it was a split second too late. Other times, it seemed to change the tone, making his voice sound unfamiliar, almost mocking. Tyler noticed it too. They joked about it at first, trying to outdo each other with silly voices, but after a while, the fun faded. The echo kept coming, no matter what they said, always just a little off. That night, Marcus woke up to the sound of someone talking. At first he thought it was Tyler, but when he looked over, his brother was fast asleep. The voice was coming from the woods, just beyond the edge of the firelight. It was his own voice, repeating things he'd said earlier, but twisted words he didn't remember saying. Laughter that didn't sound like his. He tried to wake Tyler, but his brother wouldn't budge. The voice kept going, getting louder, closer. Marcus lay there, paralyzed, listening as the echoes circled the camp, whispering secrets only he should have known. When the sun came up, everything was quiet. Tyler woke up like nothing had happened, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. They packed up and left that morning, cutting the trip short. On the drive home, Marcus tried to talk about what he'd heard, but Tyler just shrugged it off. "You probably just had a bad dream," he said. But Marcus knew it wasn't a dream. He still hears that echo sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world. The rest of the night was a blur. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound felt like a threat. I barely made it through my rounds, my flashlight trembling in my hand. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled out of the building, exhausted and shaken. I thought about quitting. I really did, but something kept pulling me back. A need to understand, to see it through. Maybe it was pride, or maybe just stubbornness. Either way, I showed up for my next shift, determined to get answers. The next few nights were more of the same. Flickering cameras, strange noises, the feeling of being watched. But then, things escalated. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, echoing off the walls, always just out of sight. I started walking faster, my heart racing. The footsteps matched my pace, growing louder, closer. I broke into a run, sprinting down the hallway toward the security office. The footsteps pounded behind me, impossibly fast. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The footsteps stopped. I pressed my back against the door, gasping for breath. Listening. Silence. I checked the cameras, but the hallways were empty. I rewound the footage, but the tape glitched, skipping over the moment I'd been chased. I sat there for the rest of the night, too afraid to leave the office. The next morning, Frank found me still sitting there, eyes bloodshot, hands shaking. He didn't say anything, just handed me a cup of coffee and sat down beside me. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound, the hum of the monitors. Finally, he spoke. "You should leave," he said quietly. "This place, it changes people, makes them see things, do things they wouldn't normally do. I've seen good men lose themselves here. Don't let it happen to you." I wanted to listen. I really did, but I couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not until I knew the truth. I started digging. During the day, I scoured the internet for any mention of the Merriwick complex. Most of what I found was dry, old business records, property transfers, a few news clippings about layoffs and bankruptcies. But buried in the archives, I found something that made my skin crawl. A series of articles from the 1970s about a string of disappearances. Workers who'd clocked in for the night shift and never clocked out. The police had investigated, but nothing ever came of it. The company blamed poor record keeping, and the cases faded into obscurity. There were rumors that stories about strange lights, voices in the walls, shadows that moved on their own. One article mentioned a fire in the East Wing, but the cause was never determined. Another described a worker found wandering the grounds at dawn, muttering about the watchers and refusing to go back inside. He quit the next day and left town. No one ever heard from him again. I printed out everything I could find and brought it to work, spreading the papers across the desk in the security office. Frank glanced at them but didn't say a word. I could tell he'd seen it all before. Maybe he'd even lived through some of it. That night, I decided to do something reckless. I waited until 2 a.m., then left the safety of the security office and made my way to the loading bay. The air was thick with the smell of old oil and dust, the only light coming from the flickering security lamp overhead. I stood in the center of the bay, heart pounding, and waited. At 2:13, the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air, even though it was the middle of summer. The shadows seemed to lengthen, creeping across the concrete toward me. I heard a whisper so faint I thought I was imagining it. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught nothing but empty air, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I backed away, my hands shaking, and hurried back to the security office. When I checked the cameras, the footage was blank. The entire loading bay was swallowed by static. The timestamp frozen at 2:13. I tried to record it on my phone, but the screen just showed a mess of black and white lines, like the signal was being jammed. I wrote everything down in my journal, every detail I could remember. The cold, the whispers, the sense of dread. I tried to make sense of it, to find a pattern, but the more I wrote, the less I understood. The next night, I brought a small tape recorder with me. If the cameras wouldn't work, maybe I could at least capture the audio. I set it up in the loading bay, hidden behind a stack of crates, and went back to the office to watch the monitors. At 2:13, the same thing happened. The camera flickered, the image warped, and the figure appeared, closer this time, almost at the edge of the light. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to stay put, watching as the figure raised its arm and pointed at the camera. The screen went black. When the image returned, the bay was empty. I waited until sunrise, then retrieved the tape recorder. My hands shook as I pressed play. At first, all I heard was static. Then, beneath the noise, a faint whisper. I turned up the volume, straining to make out the words. It was my name, over and over, whispered in a voice that wasn't quite human. My name repeated again and again, growing louder, more insistent, until it was a scream. I dropped the recorder, my heart racing. I wanted to run, to quit, to never set foot in that building again. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when I was so close to understanding. I started to see the figure in other places, too. Reflected in the glass of the office door, standing at the end of the hallway, lurking in the corners of my vision, always watching, always waiting. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my rounds, but it was always there. Frank noticed the change in me. He didn't say anything, but I could see the worry in his eyes. One morning, as he was clocking in, he handed me a small, battered book. "Found this in the lost and found," he said. "Might help." I opened it and found page after page of handwritten notes, journal entries from previous guards. Some were short, just a few lines about strange noises or flickering lights. Others were longer, filled with frantic scrawls and desperate pleas for help. One entry caught my eye. If you see it, don't look away. If you look away, it gets closer. If you run, it follows. If you hide, it waits. The only way out is through. I read the entry over and over, trying to make sense of it. Was it a warning? A set of instructions? I didn't know, but I copied it into my own journal, just in case. That night, I decided to follow the advice. When the figure appeared on camera 12, I didn't look away. I stared at the screen, forcing myself to meet its gaze. The longer I looked, the clearer it became. Its face was a shifting mass of shadows, eyes like empty voids, mouth twisted into a silent scream. It raised its arm, pointing at me, and I felt a cold hand close around my heart. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around me. I heard the whisper again, louder this time, echoing in my mind. My name, over and over, until it was all I could hear. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The screen went black and the figure was gone. I gasped for air, my body shaking with adrenaline. I checked the time. 2:17 a.m. 4 minutes had passed, but it felt like hours. I wrote everything down, every detail, every sensation. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I was getting closer to the truth. The days started to blur together. I slept in fits and starts, haunted by dreams of endless hallways and flickering lights. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the echo of my name still ringing in my ears. My friends stopped calling. My family's texts went unanswered. I was obsessed, consumed by the need to understand what was happening at my... One evening, as I was getting ready for my shift, I noticed something strange. My journal, the one I'd been filling with notes and observations, was missing. I tore apart my apartment, searching every drawer, every shelf, but it was gone. In its place, on my kitchen table, was a single sheet of paper. On it, written in shaky handwriting, was a message. "You're not alone." I stared at the note, my mind racing. Was it a threat, a warning, or something else entirely? I brought it with me to work, tucking it into my pocket like a talisman. When I showed it to Frank, he just shook his head. "It's starting," he said quietly. "You need to be careful." That night the building felt different. The air was heavy, charged with static. The lights flickered more than usual, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. I made my rounds, flashlight in hand, every sense on high alert. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, each turn leading me deeper into the maze. At 2:13, I was in the East Wing, far from the safety of the security office. The temperature dropped, and the smell of burning wax filled the air. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, shining my light down the hallway, but there was nothing there, just the echo of my own fear. I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps followed, always just out of sight. I tried to ignore them, to focus on my route, but they grew louder, more insistent. I broke into a run, sprinting through the maze of corridors, desperate to reach the office. As I rounded a corner, I slammed into something solid. I stumbled back, raising my flashlight, and found myself face to face with the figure. It was taller than I remembered, its face a swirling mass of darkness, its eyes two bottomless pits. It reached out, its hand impossibly long, and touched my shoulder. The world went silent, the lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure leaned in, its mouth inches from my ear. I felt its breath, cold and damp, as it whispered my name. Then, just as suddenly, the light snapped back on. The figure was gone. I was alone in the hallway, my heart racing, my skin cold with sweat. I stumbled back to the security office, locking the door behind me. I sat there for the rest of the night, staring at the monitors, waiting for something, anything, to happen. When the sun rose, I found another note on the desk. This one was written in the same shaky handwriting. "Don't trust the cameras." I stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. The cameras were my only link to the outside world, my only way to see what was happening in the building. If I couldn't trust them, what could I trust? I decided to test the theory. That night, I left the security office and made my rounds without looking at the monitors. I relied on my flashlight, my instincts, and the map I'd memorized over the past few weeks. The building felt different, quieter, almost peaceful. The shadows didn't seem as threatening, the air not as heavy. But as I passed the loading bay, I heard a voice. Not a whisper this time, but a clear, unmistakable voice calling my name. I froze. Every muscle in my body tensed. The voice came again, closer now, echoing off the concrete walls. I turned, shining my light into the darkness. The figure stood at the edge of the bay, its face still a blur, its eyes locked on mine. It didn't move, didn't speak, it just watched. I forced myself to keep walking, refusing to look away. The figure followed, always just out of reach, always watching. I finished my rounds and returned to the office, my nerves frayed, my mind racing. When I checked the cameras, the footage was normal. No glitches, no static, no sign of the figure. It was as if nothing had happened. I wrote everything down, every detail, every sensation. I was starting to see a pattern. The more I relied on the cameras, the more the figure appeared. The more I trusted my own senses, the less power it seemed to have. I shared my theory with Frank. He listened, his expression grave. The cameras don't show you the truth, he said. They show you what it wants you to see. That's how it gets in your head. That's how it finds you. I asked him what it was, but he just shook his head. No one knows. Some say it's a ghost, others think it's something older, something that's always been here. All I know is, the more you look, the more it sees you. I didn't sleep that day. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my mind. I was scared, more scared than I'd ever been. But I was also determined. I wasn't going to let it win. I wasn't going to let it drive me out. That night I left my phone, my flashlight, and my notebook in the office. I walked the halls in darkness, relying only on my memory and my instincts. The building was silent, the air thick with anticipation. I felt the figure watching, felt its presence in every shadow, but I refused to acknowledge it. When I finished my rounds, I returned to the office and found a third note on the desk. You're getting closer. The message rattled me. You're getting closer, closer to what? The truth, the edge of madness. I didn't know, but I felt it in my bones. Something was building. A tension in the air that grew heavier with every passing night. I started to notice things outside of work, too. Shadows that lingered too long in the corners of my apartment. The feeling of being watched as I walked home in the early morning light. Once, I caught a glimpse of a tall, thin figure reflected in a shop window, only to turn and find the street empty. I tried to talk to Frank about it, but he was growing distant, distracted. He'd started coming in late, leaving early, barely saying a word. The lines on his face seemed deeper, his eyes hollow. One morning, I found him sitting in the break room, staring at nothing. It's getting stronger, he whispered, almost to himself. It knows you're not afraid. That night, I decided to push further. I brought the battered book of old guard journals with me, flipping through the pages as I sat in the security office. Most of the entries were rambling, disjointed, but a few stood out. Warnings, advice, desperate pleas. One entry, dated nearly 20 years ago, caught my eye. If you want to see the truth, go to the basement, but be warned, once you see, you can't unsee. The cameras won't help you down there, only your own eyes. I'd never been to the basement. Frank had told me it was off limits, that the door was always locked. But that night, as I made my rounds, I found the door standing open, a faint light spilling out onto the concrete floor. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity, and maybe something darker, pulled me forward. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The air was cold, damp, filled with the scent of earth and old stone. My footsteps echoed off the walls, the sound swallowed by the thick silence. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a long hallway lined with rusted pipes and broken light fixtures. The only illumination came from a single bare bulb, flickering at the far end. I walked slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls were covered in graffiti, strange symbols, names, dates. Some of the writing looked fresh, as if someone had been down here recently. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the grooves carved deep into the concrete. At the end of the hallway, I found a heavy metal door, slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small, windowless, filled with old filing cabinets and stacks of yellowed papers. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a monitor, an old, boxy CRT, humming softly. I approached the monitor, my reflection warped in the curved glass. The screen was filled with static, but as I watched, an image began to form. It was the loading bay, seen from a strange angle, as if the camera were hidden in the ceiling. The figure stood in the center of the frame, its face turned toward the lens. It raised its arm, pointing, not at the camera, but at me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure stepped closer, its face filling the screen. Its eyes were endless, swirling voids, its mouth a gaping maw. I felt a pressure in my head, a buzzing in my ears. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around me. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. The figure's gaze held me, pinning me in place. I felt memories slipping away, my childhood, my family, the sound of my own name. All that remained was the figure, the endless darkness of its eyes. Then, just as suddenly, the screen went black. The pressure lifted, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. I scrambled to my feet and fled the room, racing up the stairs and back into the main building. When I reached the security office, I found Frank waiting for me. He looked worse than ever, his skin pale, his hands trembling. "You went to the basement, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. He closed his eyes, a look of resignation on his face. "It's too late now. Once you see it, it never lets you go. You have to finish what you started." I wanted to ask what he meant, but he was already gone, slipping out the door and into the dawn. I sat alone in the office, the weight of his words pressing down on me. The next few nights were a blur. The figure appeared everywhere, on the cameras, in the hallways, in my dreams. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. My journal filled with frantic scribbles, desperate attempts to make sense of what was happening. The notes kept appearing, each one more urgent than the last. "Don't look away. It's almost here. You have to choose." I started to realize that the figure wasn't just haunting the building, it was haunting me. It fed on my fear, my curiosity, my need for answers. The more I searched, the stronger it became. One night, as I sat in the security office, the monitors all went black at once. The lights flickered and died, plunging the building into darkness. I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, and the figure stepped inside. It stood in the doorway, its eyes locked on mine. I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me, but I didn't look away. I forced myself to stand, to face it. "What do you want?" I whispered. The figure didn't speak. It just watched, its gaze endless and unblinking. I felt memories slipping away again, but I held on, clinging to the last shreds of myself. Then, in a voice that was both mine and not mine, it spoke. "You have to choose." I didn't understand. Choose what? My mind raced, searching for meaning in the chaos. The figure stood motionless, its presence filling the room, pressing in on me from all sides. The air was thick, suffocating, and I felt the urge to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there and face it. But I remembered the warnings and the journals, the desperate scrawls of those who came before me. If you run, it follows. If you hide, it waits. The only way out is through. So I stood my ground, heart pounding, sweat beading on my forehead. "What do I have to choose?" I asked, my voice trembling but steady. The figure tilted its head, as if considering me, and for a moment, the room was silent, except for the distant hum of the building's old pipes. Then the monitors flickered back to life, each one showing a different part of the complex. On one screen, I saw Frank, wandering the hallways, his face blank, eyes wide and unseeing. On another, I saw myself, sitting in the office, staring at the screens, a look of exhaustion and fear etched into my features. Other screens showed empty rooms, long-forgotten storage spaces, the loading bay, the basement door. But in every frame, somewhere in the shadows, the figure was there, watching, waiting. The voice came again, softer this time, echoing in my mind. "You can stay, and become part of this place, or you can leave, and take me with you." The choice was a trap, I realized. If I stayed, I'd become like Frank, another lost soul, wandering the halls, haunted by memories and shadows. If I left, I'd bring the figure with me, spreading its influence beyond the walls of mirror. There was no escape, no easy answer. Only consequences. I thought of the guards who came before me, their warnings and pleas. I thought of Frank, broken and hollow, trapped by a choice he never understood. I thought of myself, desperate for answers, willing to risk everything for the truth. And I realized that the only way to break the cycle was to refuse the choice altogether. I turned away from the figure, refusing to meet its gaze. I walked to the door, my legs heavy, every step a struggle. The figure didn't move, but I felt its eyes on me, cold and relentless. I reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily in my hand. As I stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of burning wax, and I heard whispers all around me, my name, over and over, growing louder with every step. I kept moving, refusing to look back, refusing to give in to the fear. I made my way through the maze of corridors, past the loading bay, past the basement door, past the places where I'd seen the figure lurking in the shadows. The whispers followed me, growing more frantic, more desperate, but I kept moving, one foot in front of the other, until I reached the front doors. They stood open, the night air cool and fresh on my face. I stepped outside, the weight of the building lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But as I walked across the parking lot, I glanced back at the Merriwick complex. The windows were dark, the building silent, but in one of the upper windows, I saw a flicker of movement, a tall, thin figure, watching me leave. I didn't stop, I kept walking, my footsteps echoing in the empty lot. I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I started the engine, the radio crackled to life, a burst of static filling the air. Then, beneath the noise, I heard a voice, my own voice, whispering my name. I drove away, the building shrinking in my rearview mirror. The road was empty, the city asleep, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a cold knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I tried to go back to my old life. I got a new job, moved to a new apartment, changed my number, but the shadows followed me. I'd catch glimpses of the figure in reflections, hear whispers in the dead of night. Sometimes I'd wake up to find notes on my kitchen table, written in that same shaky handwriting, "You can't run forever. It's still watching, you have to choose." I started keeping a journal again, filling page after page with my memories, my fears, my desperate attempts to make sense of it all. But the more I wrote, the more I realized that the story wasn't over. The figure was still with me, a shadow at the edge of my vision, a presence I couldn't escape. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me. Maybe it's always been there, waiting for someone to notice, someone to see it for what it really is. Maybe it feeds on curiosity, on fear, on the need for answers that can never be found. All I know is that I can't go back. I can't undo what I've seen, can't unmake the choice I refuse to make. The Merriwick complex is still there, waiting for the next guard, the next curious soul to walk its halls. And somewhere, in the darkness, the figure is waiting, watching, whispering. If you ever find yourself working the night shift, alone in a building that feels too empty, too quiet, trust your instincts. Don't look too closely at the shadows. Don't listen to the whispers. And whatever you do, don't watch the cameras for too long, because some things are better left unseen. And some stories never really end.